There we go. Welcome, everyone. This morning, Rabbi Ike will be talking to us about feast and fasting. I know this man needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Rabbi Ike Serotta is committed in both word and deed to social justice. He is a strong advocate for civil rights, women's rights, voters' rights, LGBTQ rights, and immigrant and refugee rights. All right, sorry, I let somebody in. He is also active in interfaith dialogue, with service as past president of the Southeast County Clergy Association and similar roles with the Greater Milwaukee Interfaith Council, as well as the National Conference of Christians and Jews. He teaches regularly in interfaith studies and groups. You all know what he does here at Macomb Solel Lakeside. And Rabbi, if any of that sounds off, that's what we say about you on the website. So you could, if you want to edit that, you can get back to Leah. So with no further ado, I'm gonna highlight you because I can, and it'll be better for the recording. Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for spending part of your Sunday morning with me. I'm really pleased to see you all and very happy to be here, and looking forward to a little back and forth, hopefully today, as well as a conversation. But you know, that bio goes pretty heavy on the social justice stuff. I'm only sort of touching on that today, you know, but we can certainly talk about that as well. And I realize that one area of interest that needs to be added to that list is environment. So and environmental action. So, and I suppose we'll keep an eye on the news feed and make sure that Richard Branson comes back to Earth safely. You know, I think a few folks may be watching that rather than this today, or doing both at the same time if you're good at multitasking. So, but we really want to talk about feasting and fasting in the Jewish tradition. And so I thought we'd generate a list for a minute. So, and I suspect that we're a little better at the feasting side than the fasting side of this. So feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. Let's just generate a quick list of when in the Jewish calendar are we supposed to feast. I think there are some very specific times, you know, but think about it. When are we supposed to feast? Even required to, if you think about it.
Come on, you all know the answers to this. Don't make me go into the chat. When do you invite everybody over for a delicious Sukkot? Thank you. Yes.
Good. Sukkot is one where we're expected to invite people into our sukkah. I see Rosh Hashanah came up, and yeah, I think, you know, I put a little question mark because there isn't much of a commandment to feast on Rosh Hashanah, but we're supposed to celebrate it, and most of us do, in fact, try to have some kind of feast. I see Pesach, which was sort of first on my list, where we're told, you know, we have to have that special meal, and we're supposed to recline, we're supposed to drink 4 cups of wine. Purim, a few people have got Purim up there. So, you know, where again, the halakha, the law tells us that we're supposed to drink until we can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordecai. I saw someone put up Shabbat, which is an interesting one. You know, every week, right, we have Shabbat, and it is supposed to be special. And it's, you know, we may not make it as special as generations past did, because we have an abundance, and so we do stuff every week, right? Every night of the week, rather. But the Shabbat meal, you know, was supposed to be a special meal. That's you know, for our ancestors, that's when they had their best food, you know, and a chicken and a challah and things like that. So let's see, I think I saw Tu B'Shvat.
You saw Tu B'Shvat, but we also saw Break the Fast.
Right, yeah, which is an interesting one. We'll talk about that one in a little more detail as we go along, right? Because When we get to the fasting side of this, we know we're going to see Yom Kippur is your first answer on fasting, right? So we have moments where the fast becomes a feast, and you go directly from fasting to feasting. Now, in the calendar, see that there's some balance between fast days and feast days, I think, but there are these moments where you go right from one to the other, which I think is interesting as well. So we'll come back to that one.
Right, you also had Lag BaOmer,
Yeah.
the last days of Pesach, and Tu B'Shvat.
Tu B'Shvat, right? We're a little bit more modern in terms of when the feast gets added to it, but modeled on the Passover Seder, there's a Tu B'Shvat Seder, right? And again, we're told to drink at least 4 glasses of wine, like we are on Pesach. So one of the things that these feasts have in common, right, besides the abundance of food, is the abundance of drink. And that's worth thinking about, right? And that this was a Shabbat tradition as well, preserved for most of our young people by Chabad on campus, which is the place where they can get something to drink even before they're 21, often, but going to Torah study in Minyan on a Saturday morning and finishing it off with drinking, right? I mean, that's a tradition in Judaism. It's not commanded anywhere, but it's the way it's done. So I think we got them all. Lag BaOmer and one of the, what we left out? Only one that I don't think anybody put Tu B'Av on the list, right? Which is actually coming up in a relatively short order in our tradition. But the 15th day of the month of Av is considered to be Jewish Valentine's Day, and it's in the Talmud it talks about, or maybe if you're old enough to remember Sadie Hawkins' Day, right? It's the day when the unmarried women would go out into the field and pick suitors from the men, right? On Tu B'Av.
Someone mentioned Hanukkah. And the other thing that I was going to ask, what about, we're commanded to rejoice with bride and groom. So we haven't talked about any life cycle events and any a festive meal as a Seudah, if that counts in this feasting.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So some of these things, of course, apply to everybody, like Passover. And then those life cycle events are more specific. Right, you may be, a guest of the family. You may not be, right? But yeah, I mean, we're told to make a feast, right? When a baby boy is born, and you have a Sedat mitzvah. It's supposed to be festive when you have a bris, right? And of course, festive when you have a wedding, things like that. Now, Shiva would fall into a different category, right? I mean, I wouldn't call that a feast. We are sort of called on to make sure that the mourner eats, is really the tradition of Shiva, that people may forget to eat, and so a whole.
What about that first meal when you come back? The first meal when you come back from the cemetery and you're supposed, I know it's a custom, a minhag, to eat eggs as a symbol of life, but is that commanded?
It's a good question. I mean, in Shulchan Aruch, I think there is. I don't think the eggs are commanded. I mean, I think that's something that's a folklore kind of aspect. But the thing that's commanded is to make sure to take care of the mourners, right? Which unfortunately in the modern world is mostly meant the mourners ordering food for their guests, right? But that's not what the tradition was, right? The tradition was for the community to bring food to the mourner and make sure to console them that that they wouldn't forget to eat and contribute to their own ill health. I see Evelyn's hand up. Yeah.
Yes, I think Evie alluded to it in her comment. Our tour guide in Morocco mentioned the day when they go from house to house. It's the last day of a holiday, and they go from house to house eating in Israel. It's a What do
So,
they call? I forget what they call it.
Muna,
Yes,
Muna on
Mamuna.
Shavuot. So, which is celebrated, I mean, I think he was talking about the old style Moroccan way of celebrating it is kind of, everybody has an open house. You go from place to place eating, right? In Israel today, it's a lot more of a picnic day. I mean, everybody's out in parks and stuff eating
They-
and celebrating.
It's right at the end of Passover, and I've always wanted to go to a Mimuna. And they have all of I don't know how they make, because I think they're full of flour, but it's, especially Mizrahi, and Moroccan, it's fantastical what they do.
Yeah, so it's a giant party at the end of Pesach, right? And which puts it in the period of Omer, which is kind of interesting because Omer, if we turn for a minute to when do we fast, you might talk about Omer a little bit. I mean, it's not it's not like Ramadan, where Muslims fast every day, but the Omer is supposed to be a time where we reduce our enjoyment a little bit. It's a period of sort of quasi mourning. So, for instance, traditional people don't cut their hair. Yeah, something like Lent, as Evie says in the. Not so specific as I think some of our Christian friends are very specific about Lent, that you're supposed to sacrifice something, and so people pick a particular thing that they won't do. By the way, one year the confirmation trip in New York, we always go to the deli down on the Lower East Side, right? The famous deli there. And one year we went in, there was nobody in line. It's never like that. Katz's Deli is always packed with people. And one year we got right to the counter, there was nobody there. And I asked the guy behind the counter, why is there nobody here? And he says, it's Lent. People aren't eating meat. So, it's definitely a Jewish deli, but its clientele on any given weekday is, the local workers, whoever's doing whatever they're doing, the city workers and everything like that. So if you're thinking about traveling to New York and you want to go to Katz's Deli, think about going on Good Friday, right? Something like that. It's the best time to get into the deli. So
what about Hanukkah? Are we commanded?
Well, so Hanukkah, of course, the interesting thing about all of these things, the feasting and the fasting, are that they're not, very little of it is commanded in Torah, right? So we don't see anything about these things really until the Talmud. So it's in Talmud where we're commanded to do things. Now, again, not necessarily specific. I don't think that, the Hanukkah thing, I don't think the Talmud doesn't talk about latkes or donuts, right? It tells us in a more general way that we're supposed to publicize the miracle that happened, right? So we're supposed to let people know about Hanukkah, which then involves some feasting. But I'm particularly interested in these ones like Passover and Purim and Tu B'Shvat and the places where we're told not only to eat but to drink as well, right? So when there are specifics, like there are, there is a command on Purim to drink ad lo yada, until you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai, right? So how much that is of some rabbinic debate, right? But that's what you're required to do. The Passover, less than 4 glasses of wine is not enough, right? And then so there's very little, even in Talmud specifically, commanding particular kinds of foods, but a lot of traditions, of course, have grown up. The idea of eating dairy at Shavuot, for example, and those sorts of things that are not commanded, but have become a part of tradition. Let's turn to the fasts for a minute, make sure we get those out on the table too. So when do we fast in our tradition? Again, you feel free. Yeah, so Jim's blanking on the name, but he's thinking of Tisha B'Av, which is coming up. Well, Mike Zidman, way to go. I mean, I didn't know that anybody was going to get the fast of Gedalia, right? And the fast of Esther. The Tzom Gedalia, the fast of Gedalia, comes up right after Rosh Hashanah, actually. So it's in that time period. This year it'll be September 9th, I think. But so, yeah, so we have, and Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther, right before Purim, right? The day before Erev Purim, you fast, according to tradition. So that's like Yom Kippur, that's one where you fast and then immediately move into feast. So yeah, you know, there is, if you look at the whole calendar, you know, this kind of back and forth. So Tisha B'Av's been mentioned a couple of times. That's what Jim Schuster was thinking of, and that's coming up next weekend. And in some ways was the reason why that became the topic today. Yeah, fast of the firstborn son before Pesach. I mean, again, really interesting one. It doesn't affect everybody, but it's another one where it's a fast into a feast, which I think is interesting. But really, only the firstborn son, and only if the firstborn is a son, I believe, right? I mean, if you're right, neither of your boys needs to fast on Pesach.
No. If you did, you know, Pidyon Haben, like if you ransomed them, I wonder if any feminists had taken this on. You know, many women put on tefillin, but taking on a fast, I don't know of any firstborn daughters. Oh, I would be one.
Yeah, yeah. I can't say I've seen much about that, but people generally don't run to find another fast day.
No.
You know, I know there are some people who swear by the idea of fasting, and we can talk about that a little bit. So everyone, Tzom Gedalia, what is that, and who is Gedalia? So a lot of the fast days relate to things connected to the destruction of the first or the second temple. So, or in some cases, both. I mean, Tisha B'Av, which is coming up, is about the destruction of both temples. According to our tradition, both temples are destroyed on the 9th day of Av. And so one in, of course, 586 BCE and the other in 70 CE, first by the Babylonians, then by the Romans. And so one day commemorates both of those destructions. I mean, Tisha B'Av is something like the Jewish Friday the 13th. You know, things go wrong on Tisha B'Av, and I've seen lists of things in Jewish history, including things from the Inquisition all the way up to the imposition of the Nuremberg laws in 1933. So that those all of those things happen on Tisha B'Av. So it's a day of fasting, a day to be extra careful, right? In a certain sense about things.
Andy wants to know, are there still any linkings of Tisha B'Av in Hiroshima?
That's I had not heard that before, but you know, it would sounds like it would be around the right time of year. So I have to go back and take a look and see if that actually fell on Tisha B'Av. A lot of people are asking about about Gedalia and about the redemption of the firstborn. I guess, Vanessa, you answered that, right? You know, there is a tradition. This is one of the few small roles of the Kohen that still exists in Jewish tradition. The firstborn is supposed to be dedicated to God, and so every firstborn son, tradition, has to be ransomed back. So typically it's I think it's $5 or something like that. I mean, is used, so a symbolic use of coins to redeem the firstborn from service to God, right? So, that's the ransom we pay to the Kohen, right? Gedalia, I mentioned that these fast days are related to the destructions of the temple. So Gedalia was in a way at the very end of the book of Kings, so Second Kings in the Bible, near the very end of that book, you'll come to Gedalia. So Gedalia is not exactly a king, but he is the leader of the Jews who is appointed by the Babylonians at the time of the first temple, right? And in the book of Second Kings, you'll see that he's assassinated actually by Jews who are, unhappy with sort of taking the line of the kingship out of the lineage, and the Babylonians have appointed a king. But Gedalia had some followers who liked him, and some opponents who were upset about his ascendancy to the throne. So, but what it signals, the assassination of Gedalia signals the death of the death of the righteous, right, and the destruction of the temple. And so it becomes a day of fasting in Jewish tradition. It's sort of like in some ways, as much as the destruction of the temple itself, it's the end of any Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel for a very long time, right, until the Maccabees, a few centuries later, and then of course at the end of the Maccabean, excuse me, the Maccabean Hasmonean dynasty, that's the destruction of the Second Temple and the end of a Jewish Commonwealth until 1948, right? So, so we mentioned Yom Kippur, we mentioned Tisha B'Av, we've mentioned the fast of Esther and the fast of Gedalia. There are actually two other fast days. I don't know that anybody mentioned, things went by in the chat pretty fast, but did anyone mention the 10th of Tevet or the 17th of Tammuz, right? So two other fast days. According to tradition, the 10th of the month of Tevet was the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem in the time of the Babylonians. And the 17th of Tammuz is just passed a little while ago. We just went from the month of Tammuz to Av. And so it was July 17th, something like that. I'm sorry, it will be July 17th this coming year, I think. The 17th of Tammuz. But that's when the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Romans in the year 70. So, so we have, and so if you were counting them up, I mean, I think you'd find that basically we have, it seems to me, 8 feasts and 8 fasts over the course of the year. Some of them are and it doesn't exactly go feast, fast, if you were looking at it, but it's, but there's a kind of a balance. We don't have all the feasts in one part of the year and all the fasts in another part of the year. So there is a, I'm kind of, if Rosh Hashanah is a feast, and that'll be, September 6th to the 8th this year, and Gedalia, the fast of Gedalia is September 9th, right? Of course, followed by Yom Kippur, which is fast and then feast, right? Followed by Sukkot, which is a feast, and Hanukkah. And then the fast of the 10th of Tevet would fall in there in December, after Hanukkah this year. right? Then we get to Tu B'Shvat, and then to the fast of Esther, right into the feast of Purim. And so you get the sense of it. We could go through it, fast of the firstborn into Pesach, right? The time of the Omer into Shavuot. And then in the summer, a little more on the fast side, the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, and then Tu B'Av, right? That Jewish Valentine's Day, which this year, I think, I actually have next year's date. It'd be both Tisha
I
B'Av
think
and
it's,
Tu
well,
B'Av
the,
will
right,
be
the
in March
9th,
next year.
the 9th of Av is
Next week, right? It's
next Sunday, and
Sunday
so
and
Tu
Monday.
B'Av, I actually think is the next Friday night, July 24th.
Oh, well, yeah. So I don't know how we'll celebrate that on that Friday evening, but maybe we should,
Yes,
do
it's
something.
July, oh, no, well, it starts Friday night. Tu B'Av is Saturday, but technically it would be Friday night.
Yeah. So, so I want to give you that sense of that we, so we don't load up all the feasting in one part of the year and all the fasting in another. Instead, we go back and forth, right? And also said, a lot of these things don't exist in Torah, right? In the Torah, in Parshat, I think it's Emor in the book of Leviticus, there's a calendar, essentially all of the holidays that we celebrate at the time of Torah. And the primary ones that are mentioned are, of course, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, although I don't think either of them has that name, if memory serves. But a time of proclaiming the new year and a time of fasting is there. And then the three pilgrimage holidays that we talk about, Sukkot and Pesach and Shavuot, those are all mentioned. And of course, Shabbat is mentioned. But the other holidays don't even exist, right? I mean, Hanukkah and Purim are ancient holidays, but they don't exist at the time of Torah, right? So it's not till Talmud that we see any mention of Hanukkah and Purim. Of course, the Book of Esther is in the Bible, but long after the Torah is done. So and of course these fast days related to the destruction of the temple, I mean, can't exist till after Torah already exists as well. So and in fact, the holiday, we may have talked about this at length at some other time, that Hanukkah is really a second Sukkot, right? At the time of the Maccabees, the idea was that they, you're supposed to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem and go to the temple in Jerusalem for Sukkot, but when Antiochus Epiphanes had turned the temple into a pagan place of worship, the Israelites couldn't do that. The Maccabees couldn't go and celebrate Sukkot. So the first thing they do when they clean the temple is institute a second Sukkot, right? And so Hanukkah, in a way, is built on that model of Sukkot, right? So I would say that in our modern Reform tradition, when the reformers come along in the 19th century, the things that aren't in the Torah become of lesser interest to them, right? They are, of course, interested in the prophets. They're interested in morality and all of the moral issues of Judaism. Fasting, they consider to be a kind of a relic in some ways on several counts. I mean, one is that when Isaac Mayer Wise gets to Cincinnati and starts the Hebrew Union College, he proclaims Cincinnati the New Jerusalem, right? And the Plum Street Temple that they built in downtown Cincinnati, which is still there and is quite beautiful, is the temple, right? I mean, this was when I was a kid, and some of you may remember this too. One of the things that distinguished Reform Judaism from other branches of Judaism is calling the places where we worshiped temples. I went to Temple Israel in Miami, right? And the other big Reform congregation down there was Temple Beth Shalom. Um, you got Plum Street,
This is Plum Street. I've been there. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
right? One of the things that's interesting is how many electric lights there are inside it, because electric light was a brand new thing, you know. So so they put a lot in there just so you could see it. But it's a lovely place. The ordination ceremony for rabbis from the school in Cincinnati is there in that building. In New York, where I was ordained, it's Temple Emmanuel, which is also glorious and amazing. But the point was that the Reform Judaism, starting in Germany in the 19th century and certainly very strongly here in America in the 20th, was that we have rebuilt the temple in Cincinnati and Atlanta and wherever else, we built, right, in congregations. So in a few places, I think in Cleveland and in Atlanta, the temple was really called the Temple. It wasn't even Temple Israel or Temple Beth Shalom. They just called it the Temple, right? So I think technically maybe both of those places has a name that nobody uses, but conservative congregations and Orthodox congregations didn't use the word temple to describe their buildings, right? They were North Suburban Synagogue Bethel, for example, right? And so we still have some vestiges of that. I can't really explain why the two antecedents to Macomb Solel Lakeside were Lakeside Congregation and Congregation Solel. The use of the word congregation in both of those Reform institutions is almost surprising, even in the 1950s when they were built. So, so it's but so the in the Reform movement, right? Cincinnati becomes the new Jerusalem. The Plum Street Temple becomes the new temple. We essentially call a halt to mourning for the destruction of the temples. And if you're not going to mourn the destruction of the temple, then what's the point of fasting on Tisha B'Av and the 17th of Tammuz and the 10th of Tevet and even the Tzom Gedalia? All of these fasts that are related to destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. If you're no longer mourning, then there's no longer a need, right, from the Reform movement's perspective. I would say that that some of those fasts in Reform Judaism have been making a comeback. Tisha B'Av probably foremost among them, and that primarily probably because of summer camp, right? That there are usually kids there and they learn something about it there, and then it maybe becomes at least on their radar going on. The other side of fasting being relegated to the back bench by Reform Judaism is what's more American than feasting, right? So the feasts are ascendant because that's in America that's what we do, right? I was trying to think of is there any time in American tradition where we fast? Is there an American fast? And I couldn't think of one. Maybe someone can come up with some, even our solemn days like Memorial Day is a solemn day, but how do you celebrate Memorial Day besides Memorial Day sales? You go to parades and you have cookouts, right? Barbecues, So, so it's, so we don't really do fast days, at least not historically. So, I see David Macton's vouching for the temple, right? In Cleveland, and I have a friend who's a rabbi there who has a synagogue in Cleveland that they call the Shul. So, right, that's it's sort of it's a bit tongue in cheek, right? We're not the temple, we're the Shul, right? So a little smaller, more Hamish, more friendly kind of place was the idea. So the famous deli in Cleveland, I'll recognize the name when you tell me, but I can't call it to mind, David. So
Someone must know.
Yeah.
Corky and Lenny's.
Okay. Yeah. So, but so I think that we put more emphasis on the feasting in America because we're in America, right? Whether the day is solemn or happy in American tradition, like Memorial Day or Veterans Day, which might be considered solemn occasions in some way. And they do their origins involve going to cemeteries and putting wreaths on graves and things like that. But we still, if we celebrate them at all, we celebrate them with feasting, right? It maybe suggests an essentially optimistic outlook on life, right? But I think our tradition tries to temper that feasting with our fasting, right? And that's part of the reason we go back and forth. If every day's a feast, then, there's no distinction really between what's holy and what's ordinary, right? I mean, I mentioned earlier, Shabbat dinner is supposed to be the best dinner of the week. When I was in college, I lived in a house, a Havurah of Jews. There were 25 Jews, undergraduates living together in an old sorority house in Madison, Wisconsin. It was actually called Kibbutz Langdon. And we cooked meals together all week long. So there was dinner every night, but Shabbat was special, right? We made our own challah. I mean, that was actually, the house was mostly vegetarian. I was completely vegetarian in those days. But on Friday night, there were roast chickens, right? And, it was clearly designed to be the best meal of the week. So feasting is a way to make a day special, and fasting is a way to make a day special, to change the, to recognize the difference, right? So, Rick, you only got half a comment in there. The concern how to make a.
It was hence the concern of how to make Juneteenth distinct. I know the concern in the Black community, what to do with it.
Right, and yeah, it was we have this sort of discussion pretty regularly about Dr. King too. MLK Day, should there be school or shouldn't there be school, right? Holidays are marked in American tradition by giving people the day off, right, from school and from work and so forth. But the argument would be that Dr. King was all about people getting educated, right? So the idea that we don't learn on MLK Day would be problematic for him, right? And it's problematic for his legacy. So yeah, and so it'll be interesting to see how now that Juneteenth is a federal holiday, it'll be interesting to see how that develops, right? Will it develop as in any way a solemn day? Are we going to? I don't know. Maybe there already were there Juneteenth sales and things like that? Mattress sales on Juneteenth. I don't know. We'll have to watch and see how those things develop.
I don't see that happening. And, but, because I don't think there's any Martin Luther King Jr. sales either.
Right. Well,
There's President's Day sales.
Yeah. So look, I'm maybe sometimes a century has to pass before you can. Yeah. Pam said yet, right? And I think that's part of the point, right? Is we can't we mark Dr. King's birthday, not his yahrzeit, so it is a celebration, but it gets tied up, of course, in our living memory of his life and death. So I think people are not quite yet ready to say, the MLK Day sale is not, but a generation from now, if there's still such a thing as retail, there might be there might very well be sales. So
Karen has a really great question.
Yeah.
I around the quality of feasting and fasting. How
Right.
important is this? I find I get anxiety about doing it well, and I might put in there doing it correctly, which distracts me from meaning. I
Yeah.
think that's just a great comment.
Right. I think that you know, our tradition doesn't want you to be anxious about it, right? Either the feasting or the fasting, right? It's you know, intent is really, I would argue that that's what it's all about, you know, and when all's said and done, right? Um, you know, it's less about being, you know, doing it perfectly and getting it exactly. Now, an Orthodox rabbi will answer this question somewhat differently than a Reform rabbi, but you know, it's much more about uh, the the feeling that you can generate from it. So if what you're doing distracts you from that feeling, all right, distracts you from that connection, then it's definitely not what our ancestors intended, right? Um, so like anything else that you do, the more you do it and the more you practice it, the better you get at it, right? You know, um, you know, from something as mundane as, you know, the first time you make matzo balls, you know, okay, they may not turn out. And frankly, my matzo balls are different every year for unknown reasons that I can't possibly tell you why. Some years they're fluffy and some years they're hard, you know, but on some level, we're being asked to just let go of that, right? And just, but the, you know, the more we do something in general, I mean, the more it becomes second nature, and we're just able to do it without thinking about it quite as much about, am I doing this right? Right. And so you know, so I taught this to my kids and to a lot of confirmation students over the years. You know, one of the things I like to say about Jewish tradition, really about anything, is anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Right? So, you know, so if your fast is not perfectly the fast of, it's okay, right? The attempt means something. The wanting, you know, the wanting to do it means something. So, so, you know, you practice, and that's why when you talk about meditation, people talk about a meditation practice, right? You know. There's probably some other etymological roots to this stuff, but you practice meditation because no one's perfect at it, right? You know, the idea of thinking about nothing is actually quite difficult for most of us. And in every book on meditation I've ever read, and any teacher I've ever learned from, say, well, no, you're going to get distractions, and you're going to have these moments where you can't make your mind a blank and meditate, right? So you follow that idea to its end, and then come back to your breathing and back to your meditation. So it's the same thing, honestly, with fasting and with feasting, I think, right? It's you know, there's no such thing as perfection, but there's a spirituality to imperfection. So so try not to get too caught up in the details of, you know, the meal has to be perfect, you know, or whatever, right? Causes that distraction.
I thought Evie had a great, Evie has a great comment. I feel the same about Pesach, with all the substitutes available that we would not normally be interested in. You know, they're costly because they have an OU, and I think, I know I have tried to cut down on processing and just, you know, kind of have a more holistic approach to Passover, especially when my vegetarian children are in residence, or I'm in residence with them. So I think all of those things, and you're not Rabbi, you and I were in Israel during Pesach, and the bread there, which they make out of potatoes, you could barely tell that it's,
Well, you can
Isn't
tell,
it?
but it's surprisingly good.
yes,
It's,
it's
uh,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, you can tell, but
Yeah. Yeah. So we're already coming close to our time here, and there's a lot more we could say, but I want to get to sort of a bottom line for me, which is that I think feasting and fasting are two sides of the same coin. Or if you like, a yin and yang kind of interrelationship between the two. That our tradition tells us that we need both, and we need them in balance, right? That so we want to we understand our everyday lives by some of the extraordinary moments that punctuate the calendar, right? And so a feast day and a fast day bring a contrast, and that contrast actually is important. But even more so, I think what both feasting and fasting do is, and what I think our tradition wants us to understand, some of you may have heard me say this before, is we do these things to change our state of consciousness, right? Um, so, the Hasidim certainly did it with feasting as well as fasting, right? The Hasidic literature is full of ecstatic dancing and things, right? The Rabbi and the minyan getting together, they're drinking and they're singing and they're dancing, and they're like the whirling dervishes of other traditions. So, yeah, that you drink something that deliberately that goes to your head, right? That changes the way you see the world, that changes your thinking, that allows potentially a vision to show up, a connection, a perception of God that you might not have had if your inhibitions hadn't been lowered by the alcohol, right? So that's actually an important part of the feasting. It's not unlike, in some sense, Native American peyote rituals. It's a guided visualization, a guided trip, right? The Seder is, in a sense, a guided trip to having the experience of being a slave in Egypt and entering into a time of freedom. So it's and if you think about Purim, and until you no longer know the difference between Haman and Mordecai, right? It's I suppose it's because of Richard Branson. I'm thinking about, you go to outer space and you see the curved line of the Earth, and you no longer see the Earth the same way anymore, right? If you take a macro view of humanity where you no longer see the difference between Haman and Mordecai, and realize that both Haman and Mordecai, for all their good and evil qualities, are both human beings, it actually maybe changes the way you see the world, right? So there's a deeper thing here, and it's not just partying, right? And the other end of it, the fasting, the same thing, right? I mean, and you'll find that in religious traditions around the world, this idea of fasting in order to change your state of consciousness, right? To see the world in a different way. And if you do a fast on Yom Kippur, right, that's 25 hours long, it really goes from sundown to the next sundown. Right, it's a significant amount of time, really, to go without food and drink. And sometimes at the end of that fast, God shows up, right? It's the Ne'ilah service is remarkable, right? It's beauty, it's music, I mean, all of those things. But it's also this arriving at that service totally empty, and so it reminds me that there's a Zen proverb that if you present a full rice bowl to the universe, nothing can fill it, right? So when you're empty, that's when God can show up, right? It's and fill the cup, so to speak. So so we have prophets that fast. We have Esther fasting in the book of Esther, right? In deprivation, we have this opportunity to see things. So both of them, I would say, are this opportunity to commune with God, right? Both of them are this opportunity to change our state of consciousness and and perhaps experience something that we don't experience in the everyday when we're just breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? Whatever is normal for us. So both the fasting and the feasting have that possibility, right? And so humanity for forever has on occasion tried to do whatever it is that we have at hand to change our state of consciousness and understand the world in a different way, right? There's also something very powerful about being in a room full of people who are doing the same thing that you're doing. And that's true whether it's just a regular Shabbat and we're singing the prayers together, but how much more remarkable is it at that last service on Yom Kippur when you have reason to think that the people who are next to you have also emptied out, right? That they're also filling their rice bowl with God at the same time that you are. That's an extraordinary moment of sharing in our tradition. So, there's a reason that I think many of us, even those of us who are not sure about the existence of God and all of those things, still find that experience to be profoundly deep and moving. So, so I encourage you to both feast and fast. And not because, right? I mean, we gave an excuse for Tisha B'Av in a sense that Tisha B'Av is about the destruction of the temples and everything else bad that happens to Jews. But I think that there's an that's just an excuse, right? The actual reason is the potential to have a connection with something larger than ourselves, right? The possibility that through fasting or through feasting that something spiritual shows up in our lives. So I wouldn't be one to say, oh, you must do it on the 9th day of Av. If you want to pick another day, that's cool with me, but I think it's interesting to think about the possibility that an occasional fast might bring to us and what the occasional feast does for us as well. So with that, if there are any thoughts or questions, I'm happy to entertain them. We've got a few minutes left. Most people got them out during the talk, I think, right? So
Yeah, I don't see anybody.
okay.
I usually have Sandy Kaminsky. Go ahead and you should unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry I came in late to your talk and I'm going to listen to the recording of it. But I do always feel at Pesach, my parents are still there with me. And I remember my mother earlier in the year making the wine that we would have for the Seder. She made her own wine. And, she was a simple woman. She never drove a car. She schlepped the grapes home. She worked them, herself. But we never had salad dressing. Just salad dressing was vinegar and oil. Uh-huh. And even though we didn't like the taste of it, we knew that was what we got for Pesach. We didn't have ice cream or potato chips or marshmallows or any of the crap, I call it, that's available now. Yeah. And it was so much better then because those 8 days were different than the rest of the year. And we really felt we were there with our ancestors. It was so special.
Yeah.
And I find it really offensive when I see all the stuff that they're selling now that says kosher LePesach.
Right.
Thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. And it is one of the things that I was trying to say earlier in a way is that, the whole point of this is to make it special. So I tend to agree with you that when I see things like kosher for Passover pasta and stuff like that, I mean, my first thought is, the goal is not to make Passover as much like the rest of the year as you can, right? It's
Right.
to eat differently for a week. And the only real command in the Torah about Passover is to eat matzah, right? To eat matzah for 7 days. So a lot of the rest is tradition that's grown up around that. But if you're, it's almost like what Vanessa, we were talking about being in Israel at Pesach and how good the Passover bread has gotten. I almost feel bad about it sometimes, right? That it's too much like bread. So it's important to make these days of distinction and difference. Right? I see Lee's hand up.
Yes, I don't want to open up a huge can of worms, but it reminds me personally of what I see a little bit as hypocrisy among Orthodox Jews when they won't turn on the coffee, but they'll enjoy the hot cup of coffee, and how they rig their house with electronics so they can enjoy all the comforts of Shabbat without, and still feel that they're technically not doing any work.
Yeah. I don't know if I would call it hypocrisy as much as I'm. Of course, there are things that didn't exist in the time, right? So on Shabbat, according to Orthodox tradition, you're not supposed to do any of the things that people had to do to build the tabernacle, right? I think if I remember correctly, it's 39 categories of work are prohibited. But of course, those things that they were prohibited at a time before there was such a thing as an automobile or a toaster or, any appliances, right? I mean, so the only way to cook was to build a fire. So building a fire was prohibited, right? But how you deal with all these other things now that we have the modern conveniences are all things that that somebody has to make a decision about. I mean, one of the ones I like to point out to, is how do you make a microwave oven kosher for Passover? Right? There's nothing in the rabbinic literature from the Talmud that really helps us make a microwave oven kosher for Passover. Some of you may have experienced koshering an oven for Passover using a blowtorch, right? Getting an oven red hot, right? You take a blowtorch to a microwave, there's no more microwave, right? So obviously, in every generation, new things have to be figured out, and so that's what happens in Orthodoxy, right? So there, now they may get too hung up from our point of view on a particular thing, like the heat can be on, but you can't change the thermostat, right? And I've known people in my life who have accidentally backed into the thermostat to change the temperature, right? Accidentally, and those kinds of things, right? It all depends on your understanding of the authority of the rabbi who tells you what you can do and can't do, when it comes to this stuff. And that's, again, a hallmark of Reform Judaism is that we have personal autonomy to make decisions for ourselves. I don't get to tell you what you can eat on Passover. I get asked a lot, but I don't get to tell you what you can eat on Passover, right? So, but within the Orthodox world, so I think it's not hypocrisy because it's logically consistent within its own context. It just looks to us like, well, now you're just making things up, which you are, because the microwave didn't exist. So somebody has to make that up. Somebody has to figure out how to make it kosher for Passover. And if it's somebody that people listen to, then it becomes the rule, right?
Bob and Babs have their hand up.
Yeah.
Yes, when we had a failure of our oven in the kitchen, and we went to Apt to buy a new one, and probably about 2/3 of them had a setting for Jewish people and for Shabbat, that you could set the oven a day or two ahead to go on, cook, and then come off so that your food would be ready, but you actually didn't do any work. That's the new convenience.
Yeah. Now, we use that feature on our oven pretty much every week, right? You know, when we come here for Shabbat, you know, at 6:30, and then we're headed home for dinner. I mean, we set the oven and warms up our dinner, right? So it's not just for Orthodox people. Actually, I'm not entirely sure how that works for, you know, the old Orthodox thing was the blech, the thing that you put on top of the burners, right? So you could keep the burners going all Shabbat at a low level, I think, and heat things up on top of it. I'm not really sure how that timer thing works for them, but I guess it's probably okay. If they set it ahead of time, it's probably, you know, works for that.
But it could be a day or two ahead. That was another part of it.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, in Israel, you have the Shabbat elevator. So I know some of you have been to Israel, have experienced that, you know, Friday at sundown, the elevator starts stopping on every floor without touching any buttons, right? So,
And in the hospital in Miami also.
oh yeah, makes sense. So,
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody.
My pleasure.
Wonderful morning.
So anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Go ahead, give a fast a try, give a feast a try if you want.
And do you have any? I don't have any announcements. Watch your Macomb at home.
This Friday night, I think, don't we have a special Shabbat? Shabbat in the
the-
park.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and it's the one that's near the Highland Park Library with a gazebo.
right. It's I think it's actually called Memorial Park, maybe,
Mhm.
because there's, I think, a World War I memorial in it, but it's also got a gazebo. It's right across the street from the Highland Park Presbyterian Church.
Yeah.
Which interestingly enough is where Lakeside Congregation had its first High Holy Day services. So you can, you know, watch the gazebo and relive a little history at the same time. I suppose that event is weather dependent. I mean, there is a gazebo, but I imagine if it's raining really hard, we won't be having it there. So keep an eye on the weather report and your email, and we'll let you know if. I think as of now the weather looks good for Friday, but actually you know, it's not doing what I was told the weather was going to do today exactly. So
You never know.
oh, who knows?
All right.
It's good
Be
to
well,
see you.
everyone, and we'll see you. If you need anything, be sure to call the office. Bye-bye.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you, Vanessa. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.